Welcome, everyone, to our discussion now on the ultimate, or in other words, the notion of God, understanding the notion of the ultimate divine or divinity itself. Um, we had an assignment last week, our big project, in which you visited sacred spaces of various religions. The idea was for you to get a sense for how various faiths embody their religions. In particular, where do they worship their religion? Where they congregate and get together to learn and to praise that which they find to be most sacred. Now, for a lot of people, when they think of a religion, they often think about the sacred space itself, but it's not the religion. Right? Sacred spaces are very critical and important to religions, but they themselves aren't the religion. The question I'd like to think about is, why are these sacred spaces so important? Why are these sacred spaces a vital component, at least for many people, a vital component of their faith? Now, as we mentioned a second ago, this could be the results of how sacred spaces are places to commune with others. They're places in which you can gather and share your perspective on the world, share your common lenses through which you experience reality, where you can congregate with like-minded people um, to enjoy one another's company or to celebrate. Just like with any other cultural artifact, these could be ways of keeping cultural cohesion or social cohesion. But in a much more general sense, what does a sacred space do for a religion? We've looked at various religions throughout our last 11 weeks together, a lot of perspectives on how people are asked to relate to reality, or how various people from the past have related to reality, related to the human condition. Why are sacred spaces, such as the ones you visited, so important? Well, first, we should define what sacred means. What does this word sacred refer to? And sacred simply refers to something regarded with reverence. So these are spaces that people regard with reverence. Now, what does reverence refer to? Reverence refers to things that are important. Reverence refers to something that's valuable or meaningful. So these sacred spaces are important, valuable, meaningful places, not just in and of themselves, but one way to think about the importance of a sacred space is that it's a very tangible means of refocusing one's attention, of reminding oneself that there's always something more meaningful, more important than maybe the trivial things that occupy our daily attention. So many people nowadays have their attention pulled to their various technological devices, where a lot of their time is spent in front of a computer screen or in front of their mobile device. A sacred space is a physical way to divert ourselves from these things in order to remind ourselves what's more important to us. To remind ourselves that there's something more valuable to us than the latest email, perhaps. Or something more important or more meaningful than the TV show that we're missing, or the gossip about certain celebrities, or the commercials that seem to pull our attention on TV all the time, telling us that we can improve our lives by buying their product. Through a sacred space, we have a tangible way of reminding ourselves that there's something more important than these things, something more meaningful. And this is the heart of what it means to be sacred, right? To remind ourselves that beyond our normal everyday perceptions given to us through culture, that there's a deeper meaning. There's something more valuable than what culture is telling us. So, when we take a look at what is the most sacred, what is the thing that these sacred spaces refocus us towards, the word used within the Abrahamic traditions is God. Right? These places are meant to refocus us towards God. They're meant to remind us of our relationship to God, remind us of our intimate identity with God. So within the Abrahamic traditions, it is with God that we have our most important covenants. It is with God that we have our most important relationship agreements. The kingdom of God is meant to be our highest goal. It's what we are striving towards, entering God's kingdom. It is said that it is to God that we are supposed to submit our will, that we are supposed to give ourselves to or immerse ourselves into or with. Now, if you are unfamiliar with Western culture, and particularly with the Abrahamic traditions, the whole 3 weeks that we spent on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam may have seemed very foreign to you, especially this idea of a God, this idea of a being, right? So to understand the sacred with regards to the Abrahamic traditions, we have to understand God. What is meant by having a better relationship with God? What is meant by entering God's kingdom? What is meant by having an agreement with God, fulfilling agreements with God? What is meant by submitting our will to God? Who or what is this God? For those of us that grew up within Western culture, that grew up within Abrahamic traditions, the notion of God is kind of ingrained in us. There's a certain perception, a popular culture perception or understanding of the concept, often thought of as being a male figure, sometimes thought about as being a king, definitely thought about as being a person. Right? But is this really what or who God is? Are there other perceptions or other conceptions of God than these? This is an important question because considering how important sacred spaces are for religions, considering that sacred spaces are meant to refocus us towards God, well, our conceptions of God may have really dramatic effects on how we relate to one another. Our perceptions of God may have really dramatic impact on how we relate to the world and how we see the right paths for our lives. So I had you read an alternative perspective, and when I say an alternative, I mean alternative to popular culture, an alternative perspective on God. And this comes from religious scholar Karen Armstrong. And she goes through in her interview that you read or listened to for today, she went through various conceptions of God that may be problematic, and she identifies what sorts of issues there might arise as a result of having these sorts of perceptions of God. Now, with that going into whether or not these are correct or incorrect sorts of conceptions, it's interesting to note what sorts of issues we do see as a result of having these sorts of perceptions or conceptions of God. So, for Armstrong, she believes that God is neither male or female. Can you imagine what sorts of issues would arise if people thought that God was strictly a male figure? The most obvious is the idea then that if God is a he, then men are inherently closer to the sacred. Just by being the same gender as the ultimate divine, men are a step closer to the ultimate, step closer to the most sacred. And there could be some, and there has been some resulting inequality in social structures as a result. Karen Armstrong also has a sense that God is not a person. God is not a being. Now, what sorts of issues does she raise if we thought of God as strictly being a person, as a being? Well, if we do that, then God is, and then beings are closer to God. Beings like ourselves are much more sacred than, say, the tree or the bird or the ocean. And if you believe that, there could be some issues with regards to how we treat nature as a result. And maybe we do see this. Maybe we do see these resulting issues. She also has this belief that God is not necessarily or should not necessarily just be thought of as the creator, or shouldn't necessarily be thought of as, that which caused everything to occur. Instead, she coins this term, or she reuses this term, God beyond God, a term that other religious scholars and theologians will often use to refer to God. Now, what does this mean, God beyond God? Well, it refers to having a understanding that God, who or what God really is always going to be beyond what we can conceive. God is always going to be past or transcendent from what we can think about, because whatever we conceive, whatever we can think about, limits God. Now, if we always believe, if we always believe that what we think about as being God is God, what sorts of issues can arise? Well, then everybody who has a concept of God is going to believe that their concept of God is God. And as a result, we're going to have conflicts between people. We're going to have conflicts between those who have a certain perception of God versus those that have a different perception of God. And instead of trying to understand co-understanding or co-delving into a relationship with the divine, what we end up seeing is conflicts between people because they each have their own notion that they're holding on to as to what God is, who God is. And she points out that this may be the reason we see so much conflict between various religious people and between fundamentalists and atheists, right? The atheists have a conception of God, which they don't believe in. Fundamentalists have a conception of God, which they do believe in. And these two perceptions can conflict. So there's a couple questions to raise as a result of Armstrong's discussion here of God. The first is, where do our understandings of God come from? For many of us, again, that grew up in Western culture and were mostly exposed to the Abrahamic traditions, traditionally in popular culture, God is seen as male. God is seen as a person. God is seen as the creator, as that which began everything. Where does that come from? Where does the understanding come from? And if that's not the only way of understanding God, of trying to perceive God, then what other sorts of conceptions are there? How else could we have a relationship with God? What else can we imagine God being like if not these? Well, a lot of this stems from the narratives that we're exposed to in the various religions. We can just even take a look at the most basic fundamental narrative that we began our study of the Abrahamic traditions with, the narrative of creation. And we see within the creation story this notion that God created the earth, created the world. So we see God as creator, God as beginning the whole cycle of life. God is the person that tells Adam and Eve, hey, you can have anything you want within this garden, but you should not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God is seen as a person here, right? As the creator person. God is seen as the individual that creates the rules, that creates the structure with which we're supposed to follow and live our lives. And then once Adam and Eve decide to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, God banishes them from the garden. So the God seems like a very person, a person, not very person. God seems to be a person in this sort of narrative, right? When we take a look then at the underlying foundational context with which we see the three various Abrahamic traditions, they all share the following, right? That God created this perfect place for us, this garden, and then because of our decision, we are expelled. We are expelled from this garden. And all three religions provide to us narratives and ways that they say we can reestablish this relationship with God, to reestablish living within a better place, something more akin to the garden, whether it be in heaven, the kingdom of God, etc. So, to better understand then God, to better see, have a sense for what the sacred thing is, the sacred concept of God is, we may have to look beyond literal interpretations of the narrative. So let's do that. There are many ways of trying to understand this foundational narrative. There are lots of different ways of interpreting what these faiths are telling us through this sort of story. Just like we did with the Eastern traditions, it might be worthwhile to take a look to see what we can glean, what sorts of wisdom we can glean about psychology and sociology and about the world at large if we were to see reality through the lenses of these Abrahamic traditions. So, in a very, very basic sense, right, here are the commonalities between these religions. And in popular culture, and for many people, many adherents of these religions, they'll have a very literal interpretation of the narrative, right? They'll see the narrative as pointing to a very real, metaphysical, spiritual sort of truth. That there is a spiritual world, that God exists, right? That God exists as a non-physical entity, a transcendent entity in another sort of dimension, a very spiritual dimension. And that we can have it, we can have existence there, we can have access to it, access to heaven, access to the kingdom of God. These are being very real, metaphysical, spiritual places. And that we can rely on God to provide us guidance, that we can speak to God, that we communicate with God, that God can communicate with us in a very real, literal, spiritual sense to guide us towards these sorts of places. So then the goal within this sort of literal metaphysical interpretation, the goal is to establish this relationship with the metaphysical God, with the very real spiritual God, and to enter into this sort of very real spiritual metaphysical place, this perfect place, this heaven, this kingdom of God. So you can see how this could give hope, right? You can see how this could inspire people, that there's more to the world in this physical dimension, in this physical plane, that there's something larger meant for us all. Lots of very great political movements were founded on the hope of this sort of very spiritual metaphysical interpretation. But what else can we say? Well, maybe, and some people will say, maybe this narrative is referring to physical or cosmological truths. And what does that mean? Well, the narrative says that we all come from the same place, that all humanity stems from the Garden of Eden, that we're all sons and daughters of the very first man, very first woman. If we don't take that literally, it could really be pointing to a truth about the physical origins of humanity. We know, at least science tell us that evolutionary speaking, all humanity originated from Africa. That the human species was born on this continent and then moved out, spread out after being born within this continent. Another way to think about this in terms of a cosmological truth is to realize that all of us physically come from literally the same place in a very cosmological sense. We all come from this thing referred to as the Big Bang. Right? The Big Bang was a point in time where it was obvious that we were all unified, that everything was perfect. And then we expanded, right? We grew out of it. And we experienced things as a result of growing out of it. We experienced differences between this and that. When we talk about being banished from the garden, maybe this is pointing to a very physical, cosmological truth. If you think about it, this might be referring to how when we take a look at the brain and how it thinks, over time, the brain develops personal identity. It develops a individualistic sense of self. Over time, if you just take a look at just children from infancy to older age, over time, the brain develops the capacity for making judgments, saying this is good, this is bad. But at the very earliest stages of human development, of the human psyche, the mind doesn't make these sorts of distinctions. Right? The mind doesn't judge this as being good, this as being bad. When we take a look at primitive people, culturally, there's less sense of ego. There's less sense of judgment. And if you can imagine what that life would have felt like, if you can imagine living this sort of indigenous life, right? Where before the development of a personal identity, before the development of an ego, things may seem more perfect because there's no judging one another. There's no comparing one another. There's no saying, hey, you have better shoes than I do. You have a better car than I do. Right? There's no need for this sort of conflict as a result of material competition. All we cared about was surviving, was being with one another, make it through the next day. Maybe life was more in harmony before we developed a sense of I, sense of ego, that made us start to have things like pride and envy. Before socialization, before being taught that we should have certain tools like cell phones or cars or houses, can we imagine what life would have been like? Would there be much in terms of comparison and expectation and want and desire and trying to show ourselves as being better than somebody else? If we take a look at indigenous cultures, we don't often see it that much. What we see more is an emphasis on harmony with the natural environment. You remember that through our discussion of the Aborigine and with Native American cultures? There seems to be much more emphasis on harmony with the environment because there's less need to worry about individual status. So maybe this is what's being referred to in this narrative, that the goal is to return to this sort of paradise of consciousness, this very this very very pure sort of awareness, right? Beyond or before socialization, sort of awareness beyond transcending ego awareness. Maybe it's pointing to how we can get back into a environmental harmony, right? Where we came from was the Big Bang, and then we start to see ourselves as being separate from the Big Bang, right? We see ourselves as something within the Big Bang or the result of or being in the result of the Big Bang, when in fact, as we looked at in the first half of the course, maybe we need to realize that we are part of this thing that we call the Big Bang, and what we need to do is reharmonize ourselves with all of nature, all of the world. And if we can get beyond the part of the brain that loves to judge and criticize, compare, maybe we can develop this harmony a lot more easier. If we can get past the part of the brain that thinks are good and bad and right and wrong in the world, maybe we can get along better with those around us, with other people. Because oftentimes it's our judgment of them or our perceived or what we perceive to be their judgment of us that creates the conflict. Lots of folks will refer to this as the difference between dualistic thinking and non-dualistic thinking or contemplative sort of thought. And you'll see this in all of the Abrahamic traditions. There's sections or sects within the traditions that emphasize contemplation, that emphasize perceiving the world or thinking of the world in a non-dualistic sort of way, in a non-rational, in a non-right, wrong, good, bad, black, white sort of way. We look at Jesus' parables, when we take a look at the Sufis and how they want us to get through the veil of perception, we can see this. We can see that there is a movement towards the normal way of perceiving and thinking about reality. So maybe this is what this narrative is referring to. You can also see this narrative as maybe referring to philosophical truths. All religions seem to provide us various rules by which we can live our lives, rules by which we can guide ourselves in how we go about our days. All of these religions seem to give us a path towards meaning. They all seem to give us purpose. They all tell us that we can live for something greater than ourselves. We can live for God. We can live for the glory of God. We can live for that which God wants from us. In either case, in all cases, all these religions give us meaning. They give us direction in our lives. So maybe this is what the Abrahamic traditions are about. Or maybe this is something that we glean from the Abrahamic traditions. Maybe it's a sense of ethic, sense of purpose, sense of meaning. Maybe for a lot of people, this is the heart of these faiths. Maybe what's being espoused here is our sociological truths about how we can live amongst each other. Right? We can see that they all refer to ways in which we better get along with one another. And Jesus literally talks about God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven. Excuse me. So maybe these Abrahamic traditions are really pointing to how we can best live amongst each other. They all focus on faith. And as we noted earlier in our discussions of the traditions, faith is a very critical component for living amongst each other. Because what often causes conflict is lack of faith, right? Lack of trust. Having faith that things will work out allows us to be more trustful of other people, which allows us to be less reactionary, right? Which means less violent, less protective. We see within the traditions an emphasis on kindness, an emphasis on compassion, both of which are characteristics that allow groups of people to coexist. So maybe this is what the Abrahamic traditions are about. Maybe it's about having a sort of inner peace in order for us to live well amongst each other, in order for us to have an outer sense of peace. Lastly, maybe what's being espoused here are psychological truths about how human beings think. And in particular, like we alluded to earlier in the cosmological description, maybe these are psychological truths about human development. Maybe the creation story, the story of the Garden of Eden, the story of being expelled from the Garden of Eden, and the stories afterwards, right, the trials and tribulations of mankind, maybe these aren't historical facts. Maybe this is an outline, a guide, a mythos for human development. And if you've ever studied human development psychology, maybe you can see the parallels here. First, let me ask you this question. Can you think of any point in time where you have lived in perfect unity, where you lived in the perfect garden? Can you remember a point in time where everything was just perfect, where everything was just fine, where you didn't have to worry about anything, you didn't have to stress about anything, there was really no experience of pain? Everything was one, just like the garden. Maybe you can see how this relates to us specifically as human beings, how we are all created, come from, right, our mother's womb. And here we are in our mother's womb, and everything is perfect. We don't know right, wrong. We don't know good, bad. We don't know anything about what things should be versus how things are. We just know things are as they are, and all our needs are met within the womb. But then what happens? What happens is we get expelled from the womb. We get expelled from the womb, and we start to live a life outside of our mothers, right? And then we start to distinguish this from that, good from bad, right from wrong, right? We start to make distinctions between what we like and what we dislike. And this is what it feels like to live in the world. So maybe what we see in the Bible, what we see in the Old Testament, we see in the Tanakh, maybe what we see in all the creation stories here is an outline of the psychological development of a human being. That we go out into the world, we experience heartache, we experience pain, but we learn from it. And through it all, though, we have in the back of our minds a memory that our ultimate place, that our ultimate kingdom is one of unity, is one of perfect harmony, is one of complete wholeness, because we remember that from our birth. So maybe that's what's being pointed out here. Maybe that's what's being espoused or what's being pointed to. Maybe that's the truth that's being relayed to us through the creation stories. Now, obviously, one does not need to pick one of these. It could very well be that these are all truths that are being given to us, they're being shared with us by ancient people. Remember, the whole premise of our class is that through these religions, we are given ways in which people in the past have experienced the world. Right? These are lenses by which people have perceived reality. So maybe these various sorts of perceptions of truth, psychological, sociological, cosmological, physical, etc., maybe they're all valid. Maybe these are all ways that ancient people were able to experience their world. This is the wisdom. This is the wisdom that they've provided to us about how we can best live in the world, relate to the world, live amongst one another, go through and deal with the struggles of our individual lives. Maybe all of that is being shared with us through this creation story. Now, let's go back to original question, though. What does this then say about the nature of God? Right? God is that from which all of this stems from. God is that which created, right, this perfect garden. God is that from which we all come from, that we're all striving to go towards. So what does it mean then for who or what God is? So remember, here is the distinctions that Armstrong made. And we can maybe see now why it's very popular to think of God as a being, think of God as male, think of God as being the creator. But what else could God be? How else could we think of God if not as in terms of these sorts of characteristics? Well, let's take a look at Judaism. Remember, Judaism says that that you can't say God's name. You shouldn't say God's name. And it's not simply that God's name is sacred, that it could be defamed or that it could be said in vain. But maybe there's a sense that naming God limits God, that God is beyond naming, right? When the name of God was given to Moses, we are told that Moses received these Hebrew consonants, YHWH, often pronounced as Yahweh. But some scholars ask themselves, what does it sound like when you pronounce these consonants, Yahweh, Yahweh? In many ways, some scholars believe, what's being provided here isn't really a name per se, but it's the sound of breathing. Try to breathe for yourself. What does it sound like when you breathe? Maybe Yahweh isn't really a formal name, but a way of understanding God to be breath, to be life itself, to be that which gives life itself. Maybe not a person, but maybe the breath of life. Maybe not a person, maybe it's from which life stems from, which life comes from. But if you notice, breathing is not a one-time thing. Breathing is not a static thing. You just breathe and that's it. Breathing is continual. Breathing is motion. Breathing is a verb. Maybe not a being, right? Maybe not a creator being. Maybe it's that from which all thing arises from. But take a look at Christianity. Many Christians think of Jesus as being God. Many people think of God as being the Father, right? Many theologians will point out, though, that technically maybe those are really incorrect conceptions of God. For Christianity, there is this idea that God isn't just an individual named Jesus. God isn't just a father figure. Remember, God is triune. When we take a look at what it means to be God, It doesn't just mean to be a person named Jesus. It doesn't just mean to be a father figure, an individual that created the heavens and earth. God is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, what does that mean? God isn't just one of those three things. Those three things aren't just different forms of each other. For instance, sometimes people think of an egg, right? You have the shell outside, you have the white of the egg inside, and then you have the yolk at the center. The yolk at the center. The triune God isn't like that. Isn't three different parts of the same thing. Some people think of the triune God in terms of water, right? Water can have various forms. As a solid, it's ice. As a liquid, it's water. When you heat it up, it becomes steam, becomes air. But the triune God isn't three different forms of the same thing. The triune God refers to God in three persons, all at the same time. Not at different stages, but all at the same time. God is the Father. At the same time, God is the Son. At the same time, God is the Holy Spirit. So God is that which is unmanifested, right? The Father. God is that which everything comes from, right? But God is also the Son. God is the manifestation, the world itself, the physical manifestation of the Father, right? The Father being that from which things come from. So Jesus is not just Jesus, it's Jesus Christ. So not just the historical Jesus, but Jesus Christ. And when we take a look at the word Christ and see where it's used within the New Testament, Christ isn't something that just comes along at the birth of Jesus. Christ exists, is referenced to have existed at the very beginning of the universe. At the very beginning of the cosmos, Christ was there. It's as if there's the Father, that from which everything arises. There is the Christ, that which arises, that manifests from the Father. And then there's this relationship. There's this dynamic between the two. There's this Holy Spirit. Christians will often refer to that as the love between the unmanifested and the manifest. The love between the Father and the Son, right? The uncreated and the created, that love between the two. You can also think of it as the spiritual dynamic, as that which moves things. In Christianity, the term for the relationship between these three things is perichoresis. Perichoresis refers to the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, this is a Greek word, and it's a Greek word that refers to rotation. It refers to movement. It refers to going around. And it's often mostly used in terms of dance. So there's like this divine movement, there's this divine dance between what's unmanifested to what's manifested. There's this continual movement, rotation between what all things that exist and that from which we come from. It's as if there's a continual injection, continual rotation, right, within the world. So in this sense, God isn't just a being. Right? God is this movement. God is this rotation, this dynamic between the Father and the Son, this dynamic relationship between the unmanifested and the manifested world. And we see this. We see this even in science, right? Everything is continual movement. Everything is a continual dance. And we'll take a closer look at that in a second. But we see here that's more than just beingness. Right? There's movement. It's very dynamic. Within Islam, remember, within Islam, there's this rejection of the notion of Jesus being God, because for the Islamic faith, God is immaterial by nature. God is not a thing. God is beyond thingness. This is one of the reasons why there's no imagery of God in Islam, because any sort of imagery of God is idolatry. You'll be worshiping something that's not God. God is beyond imagining. God is beyond the material. And when we do see God being spoken about, especially within Sufism, remember, we see this notion that God is that which is behind the veil. God is the reality that's in front of us, though we don't often see through the veil to see the true reality. God is the flame with which the moths strive to know. It's the flame which burns within lovers' hearts, right? Both of these, though, aren't necessarily beings. Truth, reality as it is, the burning of one's heart, the love, the passionate love, isn't a being per se. It's this relationship, it's this emotion, it's this feeling, it's reality itself. What we see within these sorts of interpretations of God is a process theological understanding of God. Now, process theology, for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, is a way of looking at reality as not being static things. So when we take a look at a normal everyday object, we think of it as a noun, right? A key. We think of it as a permanently existing thing. But if you were to take a really, really close look at the key, what you notice is you notice this continual dance, continual motion of all of these particles, all of these atoms. Nothing is ever static. Everything is continually moving. If we took a look at the key over a long period of time, right, let's say hundreds of years, you'd see that this key is in continual motion of decay. Just like if you take a look at a mountain or a tree, right? It's a continual motion of decay. Nothing ever stays the same. For the process theologian, this describes not just all of reality, right? All the things we are exposed to, clothes, people, cell phones, computers, tables, chairs, desks, all of these things are not just static things. They're not nouns. They're really verbs. They're things that are happening. They're actions because they don't stay still. They're events. And for the process theologian, again, this is not just a description of the stuff in reality. For the process theologian, they'll apply this to the notion of God. God isn't a being. It can't be a being because reality is not made of beings. There are no static entities in reality. Everything is continually in flux. Everything's continually changing. The process theologian, God is the ultimate underlying process of everything. In this sense, all that we experience is this continual process of God becoming. Now, the world isn't God. The world is not what God is in its entirety, meaning God is not just the world. God is the world and everything else beyond the manifested world. God is all the possibilities for the world and the world itself. For the process theologian, and we should note, there are process theologians in all faiths, and since we're talking about the Abrahamic faiths, there are definitely process theologians in all three of the Abrahamic faiths. There are people that see God as not a static being, but as an unfolding, as a process in development. In this sense, we are all part of God. We are all part of this development, this ultimate process of developing, which means our actions affect God. There's this idea within many religions that, if you pray, this can be heard by God, and that God can respond to you. For the process theologian, this seems to make so much more sense if we thought of God as the process in which we are all participating in. I know this might sound a little strange. This might sound a little odd. Think of God in this way. For the process theologian, then, the relationship between man and God becomes a little more clear. God is the ultimate process. We are elements or aspects of that process. We can make choices towards a better development of this process, or we can make choices at the detriment of this process. And we can experience the result when we are in line with the natural unfolding of this process. Life is richer, life is more fulfilling, life is more meaningful. And when we go against the natural unfolding of this process, then life seems stressful, it seems unsatisfying. Within process theology, there's a sense that God can't tell us what to do. We have free will, but God is continually trying God's best to lure us into decisions which are better for us. God can't determine the choices we make, but if we were to listen, if we were to feel with our heart, says process theology, God lures us through love. If we are looking at choices for ourselves, the one that promotes the most compassion, the one that seems most loving to us, is the path that God is luring us towards. A really interesting take on God. But maybe you can see how Armstrong's notion of God, how these various other notions of the Abrahamic God, might have something in common with the other ideas of ultimate reality we looked at in the Eastern traditions. Don't you get this sense that this sounds like Taoism? Don't you get a sense that this kind of feels like Hinduism, the notion that we're all Brahman, that we need to re-identify ourselves, reconnect with Brahman? Now, this is only one perspective on God, right? There are other perspectives on God. There's the idea of God as being a person, God as being male, God as being king. There's lots of perspectives on God. This sort of perspective, taking a look at this process theological perspective, this perspective that Karen Armstrong takes, seems to have a unifying sort of property to it. It seems to show that the divine, the ultimate, within the Abrahamic faiths is the same, or at the very least, very similar to the idea of the ultimate within Eastern religions and Eastern philosophy. But obviously, we don't have to respond to religious diversity this way, right? We don't have to try to say that all religions are the same. Maybe there are better approaches to dealing with religious diversity than saying that they're all the same, right? The way we decide to approach religious diversity is really important because we live in a world full of various people who have various perspectives on not just God but life itself and what to believe in and what not to believe in. So how should we approach this? How should we approach living in a world with various people that have various perspectives on things like God? This is the question we'll take a look at in our next lecture.